Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. My name's Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme. I'm your host for this afternoon's webinar. I'd like to get us started today with the land acknowledgement for here at the University of Waterloo, where Galen and I and a few others in the room are based at. So our work here at the University of Waterloo takes place on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus here that we're here today is situated on the Haldeman Tract. So that's land that was granted to the Six Nations. That includes 6 miles on each side of our Grand River. And so I'm joined here today with our two wonderful presenters. First of all, Christine Gervais, who's Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of Ottawa. And her area of research and teaching includes children's as well as women's rights, with a specific focus on Latin America, as well as gender discrimination in religious institutions and upholding children's rights in the context of child-to-child harm, as well as child-to-parent aggression within families. And we're also joined by our second presenter, Amanda Watson, who's Assistant Professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, an associate member of the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Simon Fraser University, so on the other side of the country. And Amanda's research focuses on social reproduction and resistance, especially how people who do disproportionate shares of care work in their communities and families understand their activities and imagine alternative caring relations. And we're here today to present, to talk about, to discuss their new book. Woo! We're still calling it new, right? It's still new.
Yes,
Resisting
yes,
Orders. Yeah. So congratulations on the new book. So Resisting Orders, Catholic Sisters Contest Their Church. And so that book has recently, in the last year or so, been published with McGill Queen's University Press and is part of the Advancing Studies in Religion book series that I have the honor to edit and have had for a few years now. And so, it's a book that delves, I'll give a quick brief intro, and then obviously Christine and Mada can speak more to it. It delves into the experiences of resistance and of feminism of a number of Catholic religious sisters in Canada who lived through some really tumultuous and important decades from about that were kind of in the orders between the 1940s up until the 1980s within the Catholic Church here in the country. And so the research project that led to the book was kind of going and interviewing these women and recording their important voices. And the book contains these experiences, these narratives, and kind of how to understand them in context. And so there is a third author, Shanice Kluskin, policy analyst for the Government of Canada, who couldn't be with us here today. So she's here in spirit. And but I'm very happy to have two of the authors here today, Christine and Amanda. And so, the floor is yours. Thanks for being here, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, so I would like, well, I know Amanda will do the same, but we like to acknowledge the land upon which we're living and gathering and working. So I acknowledge that in the Ottawa region that I live and work on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people, whom I respect and honor as traditional guardians of the land. And these are reminders of the sense of responsibility that we have towards reciprocity in the relationships, and certainly part of the reflections that we've integrated within the writing of our book, which we'll come to a little bit later.
Thanks, Christine. And I'm zooming in from my home office today on the unceded territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, and that is East Vancouver.
Right. So we'll start with our first slide.
Is it up, Christine? Can you see?
For the next slide, yes. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I just also will thank our IRCSF. Did I get those letters right? For hosting us, and thanks to Sarah for wrangling us, especially on your sabbatical. This is very impressive and kind of you, and I'm very happy to be here.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for acknowledging Shanice as well.
So we decided to frame our comments today with this quote from Sister Ella. We take them on together because we take them on signals that intentional kind of resistance to the institutional church, and we're going to give examples of practices and political positions with respect to resistance today. And the togetherness signals the way that the sisters, through their narratives, even when asked about themselves, were highly referential of community in terms of who inspired them or who they worked with, or telling stories about each other. And so those two themes were really modeled through many of their quotes. We take them on together. It also reflects our shared approach to co-authorship. This was an extremely collaborative and I would say feminist co-authorship relationship and work. We collaborated through pages and pages of documents and track changes and emails and calls and time together in Ontario. And for me, I was at the time a new PhD student at the University of Ottawa. And Christine modeled this really feminist, women-centered methodology and also ethical practice of relationship with research assistants. Shanice and I started there. And this was a really important time in my career to have that example that I think of that's foundational. And that intergenerational mentorship in the book writing process was also mirrored by the sisters' reflections on how they came up in these cloistered environments by relying on each other.
Absolutely, yes. So part of the purpose of this study overall was to really, I think, at least for me, to understand or establish an intergenerational or multi-generational understanding of the gendered experiences within the Catholic Church. And earlier on, as I was observing sisters in various community spaces, in terms of the volunteer spaces or in community with social justice or feminist endeavors, I became intrigued about different things that they were sharing and comments that they were sharing or different observations that they themselves were making or different engagements or actions that they were part of that a lot of people at that time I realized wouldn't necessarily understand or recognize as something that sisters may be engaged with because of the stereotypical and problematic stereotypical assumptions about sisters. And so it led me to think about younger individuals and, at different stages of our lives and different questions that we ask. And it occurred to me that, a young 21-year-old woman would, I think, feel affirmed or in terms of recognizing, or would, I think, feel affirmed in seeing how a 91-year-old sister who would be sharing potentially like the same views, the same questions, the same frustrations as they are. And so that was part of the initial impetus, was to engage in that intergenerational, multi-generational understanding of gendered experiences within the church. And little did I realize that the research assistants would, represent in many ways some of those younger women, not specifically at the age of 21, but certainly in younger years. And so for me, it was an opportunity, as Shanice and Amanda and other research assistants were part of the project, to engage, as she mentioned previously, in that collaborative consultative process. And there were so many insightful comments that were shared by the research assistants that I felt that they deserve to be credited and recognized for those analytical contributions. And so in earlier years, we engaged in co-authorship of either book chapters or journal articles. And then I originally wrote Beyond the Altar, the first book, on my own. And then I felt that, again, their contributions were key, and they were really, I think, so pivotal for the different engagements or analyses that we brought to bear here. So it was really about the kind of ethics of care and the relationality that we benefited from in terms of that collaborative co-authorship. And as Amanda mentioned, this was also a reflection of how the sisters engaged in their work. And it was something that I also wanted to engage in terms of research practice as well, and not only in the relationships with the research assistants, but with the sisters. So in terms of the continuity of the communication, that was really important from the outset. We took time to consult with the sisters at every stage in the initial stages, so taking into consideration their views and perspectives on the different questions that we would ask in the interviews, and just to make sure that they felt comfortable with either the content or recognize anything that may have been missing potentially in some of the themes or questions that were to be explored. And this, I thought, was very important, especially because for women who had been silenced and disparaged for such a long time, ensuring that their voices were central, and not only at the outset or just in the interview experience, but at every stage. And so beyond the interviews, when we were writing and publishing either journal articles or chapters or the books, the sisters and the women or former sisters always had an opportunity to review the publications prior to their final versions. And so they had an opportunity to express any concerns or just engage in consultation Often it was quite affirming, but there were definitely, very meaningful conversations that we engaged in. So I was grateful for those, for their presence, along the way. So in terms of the sisters themselves, just a quick note in terms of methods or data collection, there were 32 sisters who were represented within the study, and 32 women, I should say. So 26 of them were sisters and 6 of them were former sisters. They ranged in age from 49 to 91. And their age or time as sisters or years as sisters ranged from 14 to 73. And they were represented across 8 different religious communities within the province of Ontario, so specific to this particular province. And in terms of the context of their writing and research, there are various stages throughout the project. It started, the original interviews began in late 2008. The majority of them were completed in 2009. We did a second series of interviews in 2010 when the decree that criminalized, at least canonically, the ordination of women was released. And so we had a second set of conversations around that particular issue. And then there was participant observation that continued up until 2013. So the overall data collection was between 2008 and 2013. And throughout that process have been various changes and evolutions within the church, but also a reminder of some of the entrenched views with respect to gender equality or inequality within the church. So there was, and even since the publication of Beyond the Altar, there were different steps forward in terms of inclusivity with a variety of populations within the church. But there were still, as we've seen even in recent years, still relatively little change in terms of women's leadership within the church, and still the way that the sexual harm in particular against women and even children has not been addressed sufficiently or appropriately either. So we've definitely taken that into consideration with some of the critiques as we've brought some of the quotes from a couple of decades ago into the present. So it's kind of helped to frame our analyses. And in terms of our kind of ongoing scrutinizing, that's definitely been inspired by various sister authors, including Joan Chittister and other sister scholars, Liz Johnson and Sandra Schneiders and many others. So they've definitely been part of kind of the journey in terms of reflection and analyses as well. In part, the relationality that we've prioritized within this particular project came to light in a very meaningful way just a year ago, or even a year prior to that, when the cover of the book was conceptualized and we had a draft version of it. I had an opportunity to visit with a sister whose story is featured or reflected in this image on the cover. And so when the book was finally in print, she was the very first sister to whom I shared a copy of the book amongst the research participants themselves. And so that was meaningful to her. It was meaningful to us. I was grateful that she was still with us, as many of the sisters, unfortunately, since the original interviews have passed on. And we wanted to share and give some context to the image, but also to the opening quote that we draw upon to start the book. And it's highlighted here on the screen, but I just wanted to share, again, part of the context of it. So we open up with this quote of, "Father, that's not God. You're not teaching him right. God is love." This emphatic declaration was expressed by a very tiny 6-year-old girl as she stood up and put her hand up in the front pew to protest the hell, fire, and brimstone sermon by a missionary priest in her family's home parish in the early 1940s. She recalled that while her mother nearly had a stroke and her father didn't say a word, she wouldn't sit down. What came next was a young girl's daring defiance against a powerful patriarchal pastor in the Roman Catholic Church. She continued to elaborate. "Do you know what he, the priest, did? This is how he knew how to deal with a child. He said, 'You sit down or leave the church.' I said, 'Fine, I'll leave.' And I stomped all the way down the aisle. And you can imagine this little country church. Everybody kind of looked at this kid who's totally undisciplined. And I stand on the steps and I just went like this, crossing her arms. And I was all mixed up. What's happening here, as a little child? My father came out and he put his arm around me and he said, 'You're right, you tell him.'" So we thought that this riveting story of resistance was a relevant one to help kind of establish and animate the spirit of this book. So the girl whose critique was met with an ultimatum from the priest at the pulpit dared to march down the long center aisle and out the doors while adults looked on in surprise because of her conviction that love should be at the center of religious discourse. And of course, this little girl went on to become an outspoken nun. This child's demonstrated capacity to contest at such a young age forecast her lifelong resistance against patriarchal church orders and institutional practices throughout the entirety of her sisterhood. Her life story finds company with many women religious as they persistently call attention to the myriad of inequalities and injustices still plaguing the Catholic Church. And her feelings that day, all mixed up, are echoed in the ambivalence that women religious express in these and other pages as they have sought to manage their feminist and social justice identities vis-a-vis their Catholic selves. Well, thank you, Amanda. All right. So in terms of resistance and part of the framing that we drew upon, there were several different kind of layers that we wove in here. So we first started off with Kathy Holtman's concept of resistance that we thought was appropriate because it reflected so many different positions that the sisters held. And so from Kathy, what we found to be her kind of flip side and faith-informed concept of resistance reflected a fidelity to the Gospels and we thought this was relevant in part because there are so many individuals and women and sisters in particular who, when they're critiquing and questioning and challenging, they're often perceived as disobedient or unloyal to the church. And so with Kathy's conception here and with the work that she's conducted among other women in terms of religious affiliations, she found that resistance was very important and a very intentional part of their religious practice. And so as we saw this certainly within the sisters within this project. And then from Umurku, we just drew on his affirmation of different applications of feminist resistance and different strategies there. So recognizing the importance of awareness and engaging in active protests. Loyal disobedience was another concept that he had emphasized from feminist work, and then the alternative communities and modeling a different way. And then from Ryan Murphy's work with congregations of sisters who were affected by the doctrinal assessment a couple of decades ago, he found, or he was drawing on other conceptions of resistance and resistance agency in particular from Avishai and Burke's work as well. We also found that Faulkner and MacDonald, their work on recognizing resistance in the moments beyond victimization and seeing how women often are capable of moving on and building and growing was certainly reflected in the sisters' work. And then from Munn and Brookert, their concept of resistance or model of resistance, I should say, was kind of in a pyramidal form. And although they applied it in the context of prisons, what their model provided us with was greater specificity in terms of very specific strategies and tactics. And we wove that into analyses related to the sisters' work in missionary areas and then in terms of social justice as well. So in terms of the different chapters, we're going to take turns here highlighting some of the content within. So within the first chapter, we focused on their work abroad, essentially in foreign mission contexts. And so those were represented within Latin America, Africa, and Asia, but primarily within Latin America. And so part of the focus there was on recognizing how much of their work was shifting beyond kind of evangelizing and charitable efforts towards a more solidarity and social justice based. And as many of you here would recognize that this was at this particular point, especially in the 1960s, was very much inspired by liberation theology and the Vatican II. And so a lot of the sisters reflected on that period as a very key time for them. They were very enthusiastic and to engage in this work. Unfortunately, there were setbacks, and it certainly didn't move us forward as they had hoped, and they reflect on those barriers also. Within this chapter, we also draw attention to their various kind of resistance strategies and tactics in relatively dangerous settings within, as I mentioned, Latin America. So in a lot of cases, it was in dictatorial or post-dictatorial phases or under very constraining regimes in certain countries. And so there was very dangerous and risky circumstances. nonetheless, some of them engaged in kind of more social justice work, or were attempting to at least work alongside those who were addressing some of these concerns, especially some of the students for whom they were teachers or principals within the schools. And so they, again, engaged in that kind of solidarity type of support and protective support in some cases. We also recognize in this chapter the complicated context of their roles as women, as foreigners, especially in terms of the colonial and patriarchal and hierarchical dimensions of the church that they still in many ways represented. So there's recognition here on their very privileged positions that they held. So in circumstances, especially in foreign missions, when things became complicated or too risky, they always had the option as non-citizens to leave the country, whereas this would, for the individuals who remained in the country with whom they were working alongside, we recognize that distinction as problematic. And then in the second chapter, we take into consideration and initially contextualizing the work that sisters are often recognized for in terms of education and healthcare and social work, and hearing and centering their reflections, and pride, but also taking into account some of the challenges that they experienced with that work, but also recognizing that they were experiencing, and not only experiencing, but kind of leading changes. So recognizing the evolving engagement on their part in advocacy work that became a lot of it focusing on economic and ecological justice as well. There was also within this chapter some reflections on the part of the sisters as having been recognized as the radicals, not only in their own religious communities, but also within their family settings. So again, for among some siblings, there was sometimes some teasing in terms of their perspectives, but there were also some tensions that they reflected on in terms of differing views. And so these, again, were countering some of the stereotypical perceptions of sisters as being conservative and compliant and quiet and not questioning, where they tended to be more vocal and more outspoken and more radical and more feminist in their work. So those are highlighted here too.
So in chapter 3, we tried to outline examples of sisters taking feminist positions. And so throughout the book, there are examples of their tactics and strategies in various contexts. But here we wanted to highlight how it was a bold move to identify as feminists at the time that we were writing, and certainly at the time that many of them were doing their work. And maybe it would be a bold move again today. But about 10 years ago, when we were making sense of their comments, gender equality and feminism were certainly like popular in commercial settings. Like Beyonce had just had a concert with feminists in the backdrop of the stage. And so the sisters identified like a range of strategies when it came to articulating what we might interpret as a feminist position, and what some of them interpreted as feminist positions. So they would do things that I think many of us do, that is tempering tones. They would consider tone. They would choose their moments, their audiences. Sometimes they tried something, they tried to be bold, and they were stigmatized, and it didn't work, and it failed. And so for my younger PhD in feminist and gender studies self, sometimes I was a little impatient when reading the transcripts, thinking that there was a particular way to advance feminist missions. And the sisters, in fact, I'm looking at this a little more with more admiration as I get older, because there's some trial and error and strategy here. So Sister Noreen, for example, said, in certain situations, I wouldn't even go there. I'm more discerning of where I put my energy. If people are closed-minded, I'm not going to be the one to open their minds, which I really relate to now. And she said, and actually many of them reflected the need to be careful and to assess risk. So we have this theme of we need to be careful sometimes. So Sister Loretta, for example, said, on not speaking about inequality publicly, she said, we were very vociferous about things and we got in trouble. We, as a congregation, got in trouble. So we didn't seem to accomplish anything by doing that. All they said was they were just angry women. And another theme in this chapter was how former sisters and sisters found freedom on the edge of the church, rather than trying to make moves, against the pulpit per se. And so one example of that was Sister Adele's I do choose the circles I travel in the church. So you can see like a kind of reference to allies as a strategy. I choose to be where there's freedom to go ahead and do what I feel called to do.
In the fourth chapter, and I made reference to this earlier on when we had kind of a second set of conversations in 2010 around the decree that had been released at that point related to women's ordination. So many of you may already know how women's ordination had been prohibited for a number of years or over a century. And then in 2010, under canon law, it became a grave delict. And so we referred this to as the canonical criminalization. And so the sisters at that particular point had expressed, outrage, frustration, and yet at the same time, they were also, as Amanda just alluded to, recognizing that this wasn't necessarily anything new. It wasn't totally unexpected. It was certainly disappointing, but they were also kind of shifting their focus elsewhere, recognizing that there's a lot of important work that they have already been engaged in other spheres, being either at the edge of the church or completely outside of the church. And so they really, in many instances, talked about their comfort and preference about working from the margins or on the edges or on the fringes. And some of the sisters, even Sister Sarah, talked about how there's, so much that we would potentially be jeopardizing if we became kind of more central or more public in what we're doing. So there was an interest there in some ways in protecting what they were able to do and continue to do. That's something that they held, leadership on, or were able to kind of focus and establish the contours of what they were seeking to accomplish. So disappointing, yes, but not necessarily unexpected. In the fifth chapter, we dealt with a very difficult subject matter here in recognizing this, or taking into account the sisters' perspectives on the clerical abuse scandals, not only against children, but also against women. And a lot of them expressed concerns, obviously, towards the victims and the survivors. Many of them were involved as counselors in various forms for those who had been affected by these harms. In some instances, the sisters spoke about how they had been supportive of various survivors, and many of whom were within their own families, so some of their own nephews in particular. So that was a little closer to home. They, of course, were outraged and very frustrated with the systemic cover-up. And many of them had also expressed a lot of frustrations in terms of feeling betrayed and feeling deceived. So some sisters, for example, who were teachers or worked as chaplains within schools, who would often be responsible for coordinating confessions and coordinating priests to come into the school settings for confessions, didn't realize that some of the priests that they were bringing in had been responsible previously for harms. So they felt quite betrayed under those circumstances, and had recognized that had they been aware, they would have coordinated that much differently. So there were a range of concerns that they had expressed there. We had also, because of some of the sisters having focused on or drawn attention to not only the concerns related to children, but also to sisters and women generally, there were a few different instances locally within their own religious communities where they were aware of sisters or fellow sisters who had been harmed sexually by priests or male clerics. And they had also drawn attention to the sisters around the world who had experienced similar types of concerns. So these were definitely a topic of conversation. And as we mentioned, many of these interviews occurred in between 2008 and 2013. And so it wasn't necessarily part of the Me Too movement or the Nuns Too movement, which emerged out of that Me Too movement. It's certainly something we'd be interested in following up on now to have their perspective, but we tried to situate, as we did with all the quotations, within the current context. So we do reflect and situate the sisters' perspectives with that in mind.
And the following chapter sort of builds on the examples of their sense of betrayal. I think some of our most trenchant examples in the book are in this chapter on supporting women's reproductive justice, especially as the sisters really reckon with Catholic mores, their own sense of faith, and centering sort of the fidelity to the gospel, centering love in their approach to women's health. And so, I mean, women religious, as Christine mentioned at the outset, have been stereotyped, and in this way as supporters of the anti-abortion movement. And that was my perception as well as a child who grew up in the Catholic Church. But they found ways to consider and defend reproductive justice. And so I'll just highlight a couple, there are many examples in this chapter on their disagreement with doctrine. But I'll focus on an example of calling out the hypocrisy of the church, which they found deeply painful. So Darlene says, I dealt with a man who had to choose to let his wife die and the baby live, and he had 6 children at home because of the pastoral advice. I will never say I'm pro-abortion, but part of me is pro-choice, respect the ambiguity. And remember, so this is the context, the discourses here that were available were pro-life or anti-abortion and pro-choice or pro-abortion. And so she's kind of having to draw on those discourses to find a middle ground for herself, those limiting binary discourses. And so she says, respect the ambiguity. I got more activists too when the Vatican used their status at the UN to get the morning after pill taken out of rape crisis kits during the Bosnian War. And sisters in Africa were being raped and having Vatican approved abortions in the Catholic hospitals in Africa. And many sisters gave examples of this hypocrisy. Sister Mabel told a story of a priest who had sexually assaulted a girl, forced her to get an abortion, and yet got up on the sermon and preached against abortion. And I think what was tough about this chapter in writing it was the obvious pain and sense of alienation, coping with this ambiguity and this hypocrisy. So it's one thing to deal with atrocities, it's another to have to face and stay in an institution that is riddled with this kind of hypocrisy. And so Darlene says an example of how she was coping. I used to go to Call to Action, which was an American church reform group. So I went there and they were to discuss pro-life, pro-choice kinds of things. And we were of both positions and we were in groups with mixed positions and we simply told our stories. And I cried my eyes out telling mine because here I am, a Roman Catholic nun, and this was a very confusing and painful issue. And I was keeping a secret about my stance on abortion, which was not healthy spiritually or psychologically. And there are other examples in this chapter of church interference and their collective action. But ultimately, what I'm taking from this, especially today in this moment of polarization, is how the sisters reflected compassion, regardless of their views, and the desire to stay in the trouble, stay in the complexity of these kinds of issues, these really tricky moral issues for folks, and stay while staying and holding space for that ambiguity, countering the church's entrenched and hypocritical position. And chapter 7, I think it kind of continues along these lines of like doing their own thing on the fringes sometimes. So just for folks who might not be that familiar with the Catholic Church, vowed women religious were expected to abide by various canons intended to control their sexuality, and their virginity, of course, was emphasized as a metric of morality, the way for lay Catholics it is as well. And in this chapter, they recount a range of perceptions and strategies as they reckon with control of their bodies, like specifically with respect to these vows. And so we take an opportunity here to point to some of the logics of surveillance by the institutional Catholic Church, some that are sort of farcical when you dig deep. And so this was also tricky because there was a real range of perceptions, like in the sister stories. Some really identified, especially with celibacy, with the vow of celibacy as a central dimension in their religious life. So for example, Julia says, I see myself in relationship with Jesus. The whole bridegroom image is important to me. Joy described this not as a sort of bridegroom relationship with Jesus, but as giving her the freedom to be in service to God's people. Something I also understood less as a young person, but I will explain in a second in this next quote how I'm coming to understand it better now. June mentions the work of caregiving and how the vow of celibacy freed her. She says, I had a really good boyfriend before I entered. He married another lady and they had 8 kids. So I think I'm blessed. I'm trimming that quote. She elaborates a bit, but it reminds us that there were options for women. There were particular options for women. And one of them in the Catholic Church may have been having 8 kids and devoting your life to that kind of gendered labor in the household. And another may have been serving in this way. And for some women, that represented freedom, sexual freedom, vocational freedom, and autonomy. which was again kind of countering the stereotype of these kind of cloistered environments and nuns and habits. And so some reflected on living with uncertainty and the road not traveled, having to cope with that. Like, what did I miss? There are unfulfilled life events here to grieve. And some described falling in love in the church and exploring sexual and romantic relationships. Sort of the last thing that I find that still sticks with me from this chapter, I still think about this a lot, is the way the sisters spoke about particular friendships. So some of you might be familiar with that language if you grew up in the Catholic Church. But Claire says you are not allowed to be in twos. These were the rules. There was no explanation as to why. And many of them mentioned that this was so taboo. Nobody mentioned sexuality. It was like, you got to learn this and you got to grieve and you got to learn the ropes of these vows on your own, which of course is like a kind of discipline, to just sort of make it so stigmatized we can't even say the words. But so they weren't allowed to be in twos, and it was top down. It was never explained. Not a word of it was mentioned. And here I find it's so interesting and revealing of the church that this institutionalized scrutiny of women's friendship ironically acknowledges the inherent power and fluidity of women's sexuality, as sisters recounted these extensive efforts to keep them segregated from each other, keep them cloistered together but separate from each other. It just acknowledges something about women and the power of their sexual power and collectivity without being able to say it, because of course that is not the position of the church. And finally, the last body chapter, chapter 8, reckons with the church's deep homophobia and how the sisters came to understand LGBTQ relationships and communities over their lives, again, to the theme of sort of staying with the trouble, calling themselves to question, staying mixed up about things, being compassionate, and learning to learn and staying open to learning. So for many, I think we sort of alluded to this at the beginning, Pope Francis's comments on the non-judgment of all members of the church. You may remember from several years ago, he made a comment about all non-judgment of all members of the church, regardless of sexual identity. And this represented enormous progress for some people in the church. But the exclusionary practices related to heterosexism are ongoing and deeply entrenched. And I'll just give an example of one exclusion. Claire and her same-sex partner led the choir in one congregation. And so she says, I'm standing there facing the congregation for the final hymn as Father says, now we've got to write our letters to protect marriage. We can't be having these same-sex marriages. And she remembers her partner, her same-sex partner, is behind her running the overhead projector, and everyone knows that they're a couple. And so she confronted him on a few occasions. She told us the stories of these confrontations. And she was like brave and very assertive, but not getting anywhere. And she sort of, if I could paraphrase, was pointing out hetero fragility, right? She was saying, like, is heterosexual marriage so fragile that you think including us would be the demise of marriage? And in a future sermon, he, in describing the lepers of the church, associated same-sex couples with drunks and the abused. And she just sort of had it after confronting multiple times. She really expressed the pain of enduring this alone without feeling the solidarity of parishioners. And it's interesting, that is what seemed to make her crack in her retelling of these memories. It was not that the priest was such a bully and so fixated on this, although that was definitely part of her assertions, but she really struggled with not feeling her sort of support in her community, and eventually left. And then just finally, one example I love to think about in terms of bridging divides politically is Sister Clara saying that she struggled with accepting same-sex relationships. But she said the first time she encountered it, it was really new to her, and she found it the strangest thing. And she struggled with someone, she says, someone I know who I love dearly, but I came through my own struggle with this profound belief. And she made a decision to covertly attend a wedding in support of this couple that she knew. And she said, I have no right to judge. I try to understand it.
So yes, just as part of the epilogue and part of our conclusion, quickly here, we just recognize that the sisters' comments and voices were, their own counter narratives were in many ways reflective of various forms of resistance. Many of them spoke about also the institution itself and the dismantling of it as being a requirement for a few different reasons. One would be for them to feel comfortable enough to take on leadership positions within the church. They also recognize the ways in which the church remained quite exclusionary, and we're hoping to see some major transformations within the church. So many of them reflected on institution crumbling rather than institution building. And in terms of the community building, this was seen as central to so much, as we mentioned at the outset. Many of their forms of resistance were collective. They were very collaborative and engaged in a lot of consultation. So there was definitely, mutual aid and an ethics of care that really informed of most of their work, and especially in later stages when they realized that some of their own engagement had been problematic and exclusionary, and have worked very hard over the years to ensure that it is more reflective of social justice and solidarity and feminist work.
And just echoing Joan Chittister's calling to question, her 2012 caution is, don't be afraid to speak. Be afraid what will happen to the whole truth if you don't. And I think that is such a durable message that emerges from the book. The sisters' stories make clear that we learn by listening. And to cite Chittister again, we're all learning to learn. Like, how perfect for this moment. It's a call to abandon perfectionism in our academic work, in our activism, in our caregiving. And it represents a challenge. This book has stories of a great deal of pain, in addition to joy and laughter. But in that challenge I feel a great deal of radical hope, even if not optimism that the church will one day change, but radical hope that what we're doing here and what the sisters are representing here is a resetting of the table and an opportunity to center love in our negotiations with others. That theme blooms from these stories. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Amanda. Okay, so we've got some time for questions from all of you. So just as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, you can either raise your virtual hand or you can post in the chat. The chat's open. So just give everyone a bit of time. There's the clapping going on. I mean, I have a question, so maybe I could get us started. And then anyone else can just, again, jump in with your virtual hand or in the chat. My question is super fascinating. I really enjoyed the read. I really enjoyed hearing from these women who, again, bucked the stereotypes that we typically have of sisters in the Catholic Church and their experiences they went through during these various decades. If you were to interview sisters now who had joined later, say since the 2000s, who joined an order, which is not as common a thing anymore in Ontario, but still happens, do you think you'd find maybe similar narratives of resistance? Or do you think that the women who have such different values might just not join the church anymore at all? Has the context changed enough that just doesn't happen, and who does end up in these orders are kind of more in line with where the Catholic Church is at now? What would your kind of general feelings or impression would be? I don't know if you have them or if you thought about it.
From what we've understood in kind of post-study conversations with the sisters, as we've continued that communication, and even during interviews themselves, a lot of them talked about how their own communities were no longer recruiting. They were recognizing their demise and planning accordingly, and working towards maintaining a legacy in a very diverse and inclusive way, engaging in other kind of societal or ecological justice or economic justice, and certainly feminist justice oriented endeavors. And what they did share in some of those contextualizations was that they recognize that for some young women who were starting or who were still joining communities elsewhere, that they tended to be more conservative. So that was how it was explained to us, so that they weren't necessarily observing a similar emphasis in terms of resistance and questioning and challenging. That said, and as we mentioned previously, any individual can hold multiple positions simultaneously that may appear contradictory. So there could certainly be a range of impressions or perceptions amongst even the younger generations, where they may be potentially or perceived as compliant in some areas, but questioning and challenging in others. So that's definitely how it was presented to us.
I think just in hearing you say that, Christine, I'm reminded of the context, of the historical context in which many of these women entered the church. And I think about how, not to romanticize the present, but how many more options there are in terms of women's careers in like today. And so that choice might mean something different. But I'd also be curious. I'm always curious to look in hindsight about what kind of shapes people's choices. So I think it would be a really interesting question in this moment. Why are women attracted to joining the Catholic Church in this capacity? What is it about our current conditions that might make that vocation appeal? And maybe we find similar things about precarity, etc.
Yeah, I was wondering because obviously the women who joined in the 60s or just before, there was kind of, the big upheavals in society. I wonder if there was a lot of hope around Vatican II that there'd be big changes within the Catholic Church, and if that was probably not there anymore. Oh, very interesting.
That's when many of them left, actually.
Yeah, well, that's
religious life
see
as
that.
well.
Someone who studies numbers, you really see it in the numbers that the church has kept here. Yeah, so in the chat, Alassane has a number of questions. I'll maybe go for the first one, and I'll translate a quick, rough translation in the chat. So Alassane had a kind of a methodological question and was wondering about, were you kind of trying to elicit the resistance narratives from your interviewees? Did you go about, was that what you were kind of especially focusing on in the interviews with them? Or did this kind of maybe more organically come up, or what was kind of your methodological strategy going into the interviews to maybe focus on certain aspects of their narratives?
I would say that the concept and the framework around resistance emerged later, and so a lot of the questions were focused on their feminist perspectives. So in the first book, especially Beyond the Altar, there was an emphasis there on their feminist spirituality, feminist positions generally, and then their feminist governance and how that was evolving and how that had impacts on their feminist engagement or advocacy and activism as well. So many of the questions were focused around that primarily, and it was, through, additional reflection and working with, the very complex and multifaceted responses that they provided, that we could recognize, or that we recognize the challenging and the questioning that seemed so important to them. So yes, there was a lot left to say, especially after Beyond the Altar, so we were able to kind of reframe some of their comments around that. I'm not sure if Amanda has anything else to add to that.
Nope, I just remember that process, and for me, it was a lot of sense making on what are they thinking about when hearing the word feminism, and that sense making is still ongoing, I think, for me.
Okay, Andrea, did you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, very good.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I'm on the road from Toronto to Hamilton at the moment. But thank you so much for the presentation. I haven't read the book. I'm really excited to read the book. And I have a question that's, my colleague Amélie Barra and myself are in the middle of a book project that is looking at Catholic healthcare in Catholic Canada. As part of that research, we conducted a number of interviews with sisters who had been involved in the administration of hospitals from the 60s onwards. And one of the things that really struck us is how these women were leaders of big institutions at a time when there were very few women in those kinds of positions anywhere. In the corporate sector or elsewhere. And we've been struck at how, and as you probably know, like many hospitals across the country were created by nuns, by sisters, and as the number of sisters declined, they created new arrangements where the hospitals would be run by lay leadership. And one of the results of that is we've actually as part of that process, like sisters also used to be involved in the running of nursing schools, and then like universities took over them. And so actually we've seen their kind of marginalization over time, and even in more recent years, when in the 60s they were in like really incredible positions of authority and power. So I'm interested to hear whether that comes up in the book, and where and how. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, for sharing about your own research. That it sounds parallel or aligns with ours as well. In this particular book, we don't address that as much, but it was definitely part of the wider project, and it's definitely part of other publications, including in Beyond the Altar and a few other journal articles, where the sisters shared, very proudly about their contributions, whether it was education, but in this particular case, healthcare. And so, yes, I agree. They were savvy businesswomen and held very, strong, important leadership positions. They were very efficient administrators. And so these roles came up in a variety of ways. So some of the congregations that were represented within the study were certainly involved in healthcare and owning hospitals. And as you mentioned, have shifted in terms of the arrangements now regarding ownership and management and teaching and so on. But for a lot of them, and this may have been more relevant to one of the chapters that Amanda made reference to, is, that put them in sometimes very difficult positions in terms of how to address reproductive justice. And so in the chapter on reproductive justice, many of the sisters reflected on feeling some of the tensions in that regard, being criticized, yet at the same time reflecting and taking into consideration the ambiguity of the circumstances and being compassionate often in their approaches. And that wasn't necessarily seen or visible to the public as well. But so yes, definitely part of the wider project, but not specifically in this book, but definitely highlighted more in Beyond the Altar.
This sort of also just reminds me of the opportunities that they would have had around like a study. Like many of them have PhDs. One of the psychotherapists, like teachers and principals and leaders in health. That was statistically extremely rare at the time that they were completing these things, and so it makes me wonder about now their comments about finding freedom in these places, even though there was entrenched misogyny and patriarchy, there was in the wider world as well. And in this case, they were able to study and become experts in their fields that they were passionate about.
Mm-hmm. And from what we're understanding too, from what they've shared with us with regards to kind of the transition in ownership and leadership in healthcare and other sectors, education, but in healthcare, it's probably more relevant just because of the ownership and the in terms of the buildings and so on. That's part of their legacy project. They're really being mindful and intentional about how they're reorganizing and restructuring many of the buildings what they own, and doing that again with the intention of being as inclusive as possible and being as supportive in terms of economic or social justice as well. So again, very mindful and intentional in those efforts. So there may be a sense of alienation or critique that they experience or still experience, but I think because they're being so strategic in how they're reorganizing that, there's a strength there.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more question. Veronica, did you want to go for it?
Yes. I want to thank you for writing this book. I am a nun myself. I'm not sure how I got the link to this
Okay.
Zoom seminar, but I'm very grateful for a couple of reasons. One, the methodology that you chose to do it as a collaborative group. And I was reminded of Margaret Wheatley, who says that the answer to every problem is community, something to that effect. And so I think just you're approaching the subject and choosing that methodology was really significant.
Thank you.
I wanted to So I'm a nun and I'm of the cohort that you're writing about, and so I could identify with a lot of the things you said. And one of the things that impressed me is obviously I am an older woman, but here the rest of you are younger women and men, and you're interested in this topic, which I found fascinating. I personally belong to an international religious order, so we have fewer sisters in Canada, but we have sisters around the world where religious life is flourishing for a variety of reasons. But your book is a really significant contribution to the conversation, and I thank you.
Oh, thank you, Veronica. It means meaningful that you're present with us today, and we appreciate your feedback as well. And if I may share, in terms of what in part of the legacy that we made reference to as well, that we're often reminded as we were in throughout this process, but I think just general observations of how engaged sisters remain in their kind of third age phase. They're retired potentially officially from whatever career they may have had, but they're still so involved in so many sectors on a voluntary basis or continuing even in leadership roles. And so those are really important models of community and the commitment to community that we see continuing as, you know, women into their 70s and 80s, still part of leadership teams and still very much involved in not just religious life and the events organized by the community, but within the wider societal sectors too. So very impressive.
Thank you, Christine.
Yeah, thanks, Veronica. I got a little misty there thinking about just that is what I've learned in my life from the sisters in this book and from women religious in the Catholic Church.
Okay, I think that's a good note to wrap up for the day. So thanks again, Christine, Amanda, everyone for being here. It's great seeing you all.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah.
Likewise, yes. Thank you all for attending.
Yeah, and we'll see you in the next webinar. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks.